we finally got to speak to our next speaker. But I just met him just now in the flesh, having spoken to him before on the Zoom machine. And it's very odd hearing his voice because I'm so used to listening to his voice on his brilliant YouTube channel, Military History Visualised, in which he forensically pulls the wings off various Second World War daddy longlegs and investigates things again, looks again at stuff. And it's a real treat that he's joined us from Germany. It's Germany, isn't it? Austria. Oh, God, not that mistake again.
For the time period, it's correct.
I mean, given the period we're talking about. What's the difference? But so... Napoleon was from Corsica. The thing is, right, so... He wasn't French either. Right, so what we're going to do, please, they're going to be talking about the best German generals. Ooh, that's a good one, isn't it? So please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stage Alex Ritchie and Bernhard Kast. Here they come.
Thank you. Well, with that welcome, I don't know what to say, really, except I've been to Austria, a nice place.
My grandmother's Austrian.
There you go. So you know it is a separate country. Yes. So we've been asked to talk about the best generals, and we decided to sit down and talk about it. And Bernhard immediately said, "What do you mean, best generals?" First of all, this is a highly embarrassing subject when you're talking about the Nazi regime. I mean, really, what's best? Do you mean good tactician, strategy, good planning? You didn't kill too many of your own men. You killed lots of other men. I mean, what is it? Lack of criminality, highly decorated, highly effective. These are the sorts of questions we were sort of arguing about and clearly came up with absolutely no answer. So we decided the first thing we'd do is try and figure out what that means. What are we talking about when we say the word best generals? And I very cleverly decided to hand it over to Bernhard and defer to my guest.
So basically what the Germans do now, the perspective is Hürter did his study on the German generals in beginning of Barbarossa till summer 1942, and he looked at what they talked about, what was most important, and he figured out about 90% what they talk in the official talks, but also in private letters and everything, was about tactical and operational aspects. So basically they focus mainly, what for them is important is inflicting the most damage on the enemy while receiving the least amount of losses. Of course, if you look at German academics now, he basically also states that it's now completely different. They would basically rate them who was the least involved in war crimes. So you have this very different perspective what the German generals at this time or officers would see as the most effective or best general, and nowadays. So very different. And some of you might know my video on best generals, and you probably ask, why is he doing this talk? Yeah, I like a challenge. Because I have a very different approach. I generally on my channel focus not on names, I talk about the function. For instance, the chief of the general staff or the commander of this division. I usually don't mention the names for a very good reason, information hiding. I want to keep the abstraction low. The other thing is, I like a systems view. And Jens Wehner made me aware of this very well. You have to understand the system Wehrmacht. So the best example probably is the Battle of Stalingrad. The commander of the 6th Army, General Paulus, or infamous, was the head of the 6th Army, and it was encircled at Stalingrad. Now many argue if it was a different general, he would have the balls or whatever to move out, to break out of the encirclement. Now, who was the second in command? The 1A, the operations officer of Paulus. He was a Nazi. So if Paulus went against the order from Hitler, probably would have been sacked and the other one guy took over. So this is one aspect of the system. Now one could argue, well, we don't know. Actually, we have a very good example here, because in the 6th Army there was a corps under the command of General Seydlitz, and he pulled back one infantry division. Now, Paulus got the information about this, but he got it from Berlin, as far as I remember. Jens, you please correct me if I got something wrong. So how did this happen? So there was some Luftwaffe unit near this infantry division, and when the infantry division pulled back, they were not in direct contact with the Luftwaffe, and the Luftwaffe, basically the radio guys messaged and said, what's going on? And that somehow arrived in Berlin before it arrived at Paulus. So you can actually see the whole system, how it works. And this is another point why I generally reject the point of the best generals, because I don't really look at the people. I try to look as a system. And maybe that's also my background, because I also studied computer science. And I basically said once in my channel, I try to figure out the important factors and systems, because in a way I want to maybe simulate it or create a computer game. So you need to understand how everything works, the mechanisms, the cogs in the wheel. And for me, basically a general is a cog in the wheel. Of course, I know the systematic or the systems approach has certain limits, and sometimes the person is really important. And I think this is...
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that the old way of looking at the sort of great man theory, and they're the only ones that matter, and their personalities dominate everything, and then you've got the sort of famous the Rommels and so on. We all know those names. But I think that there's some generals who are perhaps less well known, but whose personalities and characters really also did have a huge impact on what they did and how they behaved in the war, and makes them great generals, but not for the reasons that are traditionally put forward. And my example of that is General Blaskowitz. General Blaskowitz, who was already in the military in World War I and in the Weimar Republic, stayed in the Reichswehr, and then commanded the 8th Army during the invasion of Poland. So from the outside, just seems to be absolutely card-carrying, Nazi. However, he was a little bit different, because actually, like a lot of people in the Wehrmacht, quietly sort of disdained Hitler as the sort of little corporal, and he actually believed in the separation of politics from the army. A lot of Wehrmacht generals said that after the war and pretended that they believed that too, but they didn't actually act accordingly. But Blaskowitz was different, because when the Germans invaded Poland, as you all know, they brought in the Einsatzgruppen. They were first invented in Austria, but then they were brought into Poland, and their first task was the decapitation of Polish intelligentsia in the so-called AB-Aktion. So they went around with these lists of people that they wanted to arrest and very often shoot and kill. And Blaskowitz saw this and was horrified. And then he saw, for example, a mass whipping of about 1,200 people in a small town. He thought this was dreadful. He saw the raping of particularly Jewish women, and he thought this was absolutely awful. And he saw that this was the work really of the SS. And he started to write memoranda to higher up, to officials, and saying this is just terrible. This is not the way the Wehrmacht should behave. And Walter von Brauchitsch takes one of his memoranda, in which he wrote about 50 of them, I think, and he sends one to Brauchitsch, and Brauchitsch sends it to Hitler. And Hitler just, purple in the face, eyes bulging, jumping up and down, sort of Hitler fury rage, and says he's naive and this is uncalled for, and he says that he's just basically an employee of the Salvation Army. Didn't know that Hitler knew what the Salvation Army was, but nevertheless, he's relieved of his command. And he's not punished, he's not, sent to prison or anything like that. And in fact, as the war goes on, of course, he's not promoted until 1944. And in the end, he ends the war as CNC of the Netherlands, and he actually signs the document on, let me just check, 5th of May, in the Chief of the Netherlands, with Lieutenant Charles Faulkner of the Canadian Army, with Prince Bernhard in attendance. So in other words, he's a general who had a conscience, who spoke his mind, had the guts to speak directly to his higher-ups, and with this news going to Hitler. And yet, although he was demoted and he didn't do as well as maybe some of his fellow generals, he still ended the war in command. And so the interesting thing about him is also his death, because the SS hated him because he wrote down names in these memoranda, said these crimes have been committed and so on. And he was indicted at Nuremberg, and he was going into the officers' trials in 1948. And he mysteriously committed suicide, i.e. was thrown off or fell off the high balcony inside the Nuremberg court, for any of you who've been there, into the courtyard, internal courtyard. And there was always suspicion that perhaps he had been murdered by the SS, who despised him, because he actually was going to be acquitted. He was not charged with anything, and even after his death, his sentences were quashed. So he's a very, very interesting, very complex figure. And I think I count him as one of, if you will, one of Hitler's great generals, because of those layers of complexity, because he had the courage to stand up effectively against Hitler and the SS crimes. So one of the things that's interesting about him, though, is that he did not write an autobiography for obvious reasons. I mean, he wasn't around anymore. And so very few people have heard of him. And it's one of the things that Bernard and I were talking about was, well, how do we know if there are great generals? And one of the ways that we know about them is because the ones that we have heard about have very often written about themselves in glowing terms. And Bernard has a few things to say about that.
So we have a German proverb, and it's "Wer schreibt, der bleibt." Who writes, stays. And you can, I made on my video on the best generals, I made a social experiment. I said in the very beginning, please write in the comments which general you think is the best one. And lots of the names are Guderian, Manstein, and Balck. All of them have written autobiographies. One exception is Rommel, and we come to him later. But generally, you see that, yeah, if there was a book about it, and it's a good title, for instance, if you look at Guderian, English title, Panzerlieder, really good marketing title. German title, Erinnerungen eines Soldaten, Memoirs of a Soldier. So, typical German, not that good on marketing, but it's still sold well. And if you look at particularly Guderian, I think the recent research from Pöhlmann and others has not been translated yet in English. And if you look at Kursk, for the Battle of Kursk, Guderian mentions, oh, I tried to convince Hitler that's a bad idea and everything else. There's just one major problem. According to Pöhlmann, he found no evidence that Guderian was opposed to Kursk, to the Battle of Kursk or Operation Citadelle at that point. He finds minor discussion on tactical and other issues, but he has there's nothing in the documents that clearly states Guderian was against it. Now one could say, okay, Pöhlmann is maybe biased against Guderian, but he makes also the point that actually at this point, because it was in spring 1943, that Guderian got back on the stage because he was sacked in winter 1941-42, and he became the general inspector of the Panzertruppen. And so actually at that point, when he comes back into power and fray, everything is already in preparation. So actually he making this point in his biography doesn't make too much sense, because he could just wrote, well, I was too late for that. So this also seems quite interesting. There might be something in the documents we haven't found yet, because this always happens that something new turns up. But as far as we know, nothing hints to that. And there are other major problems with Guderian's biography as well. So the same is like with Manstein, with his lost victories, verlorene Siege. And this is, I think, where I give over to you again about the whole business of the historical division and what the German generals did after the war.
Well, speaking of titles, lost victories is a classic. You know, we won, but we didn't really. Well, we sort of won. Actually, we would have won if it wasn't for Hitler, because we were really good. And yes, Manstein, I think, is the doyen of rewriting history. But all these myths of the good Wehrmacht and of these generals, some of whom we've mentioned, really begin actually already at the Nuremberg trials, where you have a situation where Franz Halder and other Wehrmacht leaders start, really petitioning to clean up the name of the Wehrmacht. Now, the Wehrmacht have been involved in. They're not the SS, but they've been involved in either bystanders or participating or things like the mass murder of Soviet prisoners of war, 3.2 million or whatever the final number is, who were murdered. And this was a Wehrmacht crime. A lot of the crimes committed going into Poland were absolute Wehrmacht crimes. They had nothing to do with the SS, despite Blaskowitz's statements and so on. And so the trials that are held in Nuremberg already begin this attempt at rehabilitation, particularly under Franz Halder. And the Franz Halder and other leaders get together and they write this memorandum of the German generals from 1920 to 1945. It's basically kind of a whole whitewashing, rewriting the history of the Wehrmacht, which is extraordinary. And the whole idea behind it is to exculpate Wehrmacht crimes. And this carries on in West Germany as the Cold War heats up. And all of a sudden, it becomes very clear to the West that we want a strong West Germany. Obviously, Germany is not going to be unified. The Soviet Union's now our great threat. And these military guys might be quite useful. One of the turning points is the Korean War, when all of a sudden, Adenauer and others, and of course the Americans and the Brits start saying, well, actually, we really need to create a Bundeswehr, a West German army. And who can we look to? Well, we can look to these Wehrmacht guys. Oops, Wehrmacht guys committed crimes. No, they didn't, because we've got all this proof that that's absolutely untrue. 1950, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer met at a place called Himmerod Abbey with former officers, and they created the Himmerod Memorandum, in which they outline what has to happen to clean up the Wehrmacht so that all these generals and other officers and so on can actually function in the Bundeswehr without any problems whatsoever. So one of the things they say is that you have to cease for the defamation of the German soldier must cease, and foreign public opinion of the Wehrmacht must be transformed, and war criminals must be released, for example, and all these other stipulations. Americans, particularly under Eisenhower, thought this was absolutely fine. Formally, of course, he'd seen the Wehrmacht as Nazis, a sort of blanket term that he used to describe them. If you read what he says in 1945, for example. But by 1950, everything's changed, and Eisenhower is very much with Adenauer on this to try and recreate this new path. And for example, we British also very much said, okay, we're going to stop the war crimes trials. That's not going to happen any longer. Then the next stage was that, well, there was something called the Hankey lobby in Britain, which was also very much behind this. People like Winston Churchill and Liddell Hart and others started to really lobby to change, and some of the German generals who were going to be imprisoned or were under investigation were lobbied by people like Churchill, in fact, who said, no, they weren't so bad. And then, of course, Halder went to work for the U.S. Army Historical Division in Washington, and he had about 700 generals and other officers write their memoirs, but they were all given not to the Americans, but to him. And he edited all of them. So in other words, all of the sorts of things that implicated the Wehrmacht, particularly this was all to do with the Eastern Front, was all erased. And so scholars used those memoirs in the 50s and 60s, thinking that they were the genuine article. This myth has very much been debunked starting in the 1980s, 1990s, when a lot of research was done showing that the Wehrmacht was indeed culpable in many of these crimes. And so this sort of whole thing was reversed. But it was useful for the Cold War to have these officers and generals appearing to be sort of lily white and absolutely perfect and free of any connection with these crimes. The real turning point, I suppose, was finally in 1995 when some historians and the Hamburg Institute for Social Research produced an exhibition and documentation showing, for example, graphic photographs of about 1,200 Wehrmacht crimes and other things, which really started to change people's minds. But nevertheless, it's taken a very long time, and this is one of the reasons that some of the generals whose names you can all probably list, and who were in many cases glorified in the West after the war, are now coming into question, and their actual careers are being questioned much more. And I think that you had a certain general in mind that you wanted to talk about.
So, we're in Great Britain, so we kind of have to talk about Erwin Rommel. So probably I make the distinction between Erwin Rommel and the Desert Fox. I think the Desert Fox is the myth that everyone wants, and there's Erwin Rommel. And I think we know a lot about the Desert Fox, or we think to know a lot, and we know very less about Erwin Rommel. Now, if you look at the initial point of military effectiveness by the Germans, they said, okay, the most amount of damage to the enemy, but the least amount of losses. Now, if we look, when Rommel in the Second World War first takes command, it's of the 7th Panzer Division, also sometimes called Ghost Division, in the Battle of France. And one German military historian, Colonel Gross, formerly, and he made the point that Rommel led his division like a company. Now, to put this in perspective, a company is about 150 to 250 people. A panzer division at that point is at least 10,000 people or more, to between 10 to 15,000, depending if some units are attached or not. So you see quite a difference. Of course, one could say Colonel Gross never was in a war involved, so maybe this is just bad-mouthing or something else. But the interesting thing is, I found an infographic in the German military archives about the losses of the panzer divisions in Poland and in France, and the 7th Panzer Division for France has the highest losses of all the panzer divisions. Of course, this is not proof at all, because we would have to look at what they engaged, how many damage they inflicted, because when Rommel broke through near the Maginot Line on the edges, he basically, Gross also notes, noted he basically overrode the whole French division during its sleep, and a lot of prisoners of war were made and everything else. The other thing is, of course, as you might know, there was the counterattack by the British forces at Arras, and they also faced the Matilda II tank, which was pretty strong and could not basically destroyed by German tanks. So they had usually bring in the 88mm gun or engineers or something else. So it was quite complicated. So we would have to look closer if these losses that are the highest for the 7th Panzer Division were maybe because Rommel led the wrong way, or because he faced major opposition or achieved more. So that is one way where we could look at this. Now, the other question with Rommel is, because he's generally portrayed as this non-political and very clean general, which to a certain degree is correct, but once you just look a little bit, you realize what was Rommel doing in the beginning of the war and before the war. He was assigned to the bodyguard detachment of Hitler. Now some will go, wait, because I got a comment on YouTube once, but Rommel was never in the SS, and the SS was there to protect Hitler. Well, Hitler was the chancellor, he was the commander and everything else, so there were several bodyguard detachments all over the place, and some became later units in the war and everything, so it's quite complicated. So Rommel was in charge of the army detachment or Wehrmacht detachment that protected him. And why is this important? Well, Rommel in the First World War was a very successful infantry commander, and he received the Pour le Mérite, the highest Prussian military order. And so he was already famous, but he was with the mountain troops. And then he gets in command of a panzer division, of which the Germans had around 10 at that point. Well, maybe something happened with Hitler, because Hitler was very fond of Rommel, and Rommel was very fond of Hitler. This, of course, also to a certain degree explains some of the bad-mouthing Rommel receives from the other German generals, because they're envious. But you already see the problem here. A lot of very different people that note, Rommel was bad, he had no idea about logistics. I think Peter Lieb made the point that I think Haller stated this, or Brauchitsch, and then he said, well, but Haller and Brauchitsch were not particularly good on logistics either. So it gets always complicated, and the question is, which I ask in my video, is there generally enough information available on all this? Can we make this judgment and look at all the information that is out there? And this is my general problem, because if you look at the Wehrmacht, when I started my channel in 2016, I assumed the Wehrmacht is well researched, and well, I found out over the years that usually when I start talking to German military historians like Jens or Chris, then we have more questions after we do a talk on video than we had before. There's one when we talked about, I think, Beutewaffen, so captured weapons, and if you look at, there's no academic study, or I think any study on how the Germans actually used captured weapons. What was the concept? We know they used them, but what was it from the top? Was it bottom up? Was it something in between? I found some tidbits now in the archives and somewhere else, but there's no real study on this. Meanwhile, you see plenty of books on Beutepanzer, Beutewaffen, and everything else. But the Wehrmacht in general is like, everyone talks about the Wehrmacht, but in the end, we know very little that is really fundamental about the Wehrmacht, and especially with the generals, because, I mean, Hürter's study was on 25 generals from summer 1941 to summer 1942. And in total, the Wehrmacht had more than 3,000 generals, and if we just take the army generals, we only have around 900. And we don't even have biographies, I think, for 90 generals. So this is also why I generally have a problem with this question at all, because it's like, yeah, you're staring in the abyss and try to answer a very specific, extremely complicated question with a lot of nuances and a lot of problems to deal with.
How do you explain the lack of knowledge? Is this to do with a sort of post-war not wanting to really go into this subject too deeply, or what's the reason for this?
Well, there's different reasons. So first off, in the very beginning, a lot of the documents were captured by the Allies, and they were, I think, returned in the 60s, 70s around. So before, you couldn't really do proper research at all, or very limited. You see early stuff, and they have their documents in private. And then the general academic research is very limited, and it was mostly focused, or a long time it was focused on war crimes. And also German military story looks also more on cultural aspects and structure. Of course, also very limited. And if you look at the US Army Green Books, they were done right after the war. I think there are a few hundred volumes. Yes. So Germany has the semi-official history, das Deutsche Reich und der Zweite Weltkrieg, in English, the Germany and the Second World War, which has 10 volumes, but some have 2 parts, like 5, 9, and 10. So I think in total it's 15. And I think up to part 8, volume 8, they were translated into English. They started in late 1970s and finished about, I think, 2010, 2015 or something. So it took them more than 20 years, and these are just 15 volumes, and they, of course, can't deal in any detail with anything else. I looked some stuff up. It's basically like the Reshef, the several battles of Reshef. They make up a few pages. I think the Winter War, the finish, is basically just mentioned. So, and of course, when they were finished, everything was all dated from the very first volumes already, because it started in the in the late 70s. And then there was, of course, the Russian archives were open for a short time. And also, to a certain degree, if you do too much military stuff in Germany and Austria and not enough on the war crime side, or you get some suspicious looks generally, and it's a bit problematic. So this is also, and then there's generally the point, for instance, there's almost no operational history. I think there's one academic work on the Battle of the Bulge, and it's from, I think it was started in the 70s as a PhD and finished, and then it was published as a book in the 80s or something. So this is the Battle of the Bulge, and for instance, it's particularly interesting if you look at D-Day. There's Peter Lieb did one popular work and one really in-depth study, and I think there are 2 or 3 more, but that's it. And if you look at D-Day on the American or British side, yeah, you look
a second mountain, yeah,
an overwhelming amount of books. So in some cases we have, I guess there are some speakers here who wrote more books on D-Day than the German academics wrote on D-Day together.
So do German and Austrian scholars use the English works, or is there just not that much interest?
I didn't look too much at the bibliographies. I think Peter Lieb certainly did. I think he was a lecturer at Sandhurst, but I remember, for instance, that I think Glantz which he's the American expert on the Eastern Front, didn't show up too much in some of the books. It depends also of the author, on the generation and everything else. There's also some shift happening, because you look at certain new works and you see suddenly, okay, they more or less the predecessor in the same institute or something. So there's also the generational shift. One historian told me, so what is your age? And I say, I'm around 40. And I say, yeah, like me. And then he said, we are the first generation that was not directly connected to the war. The first generation where they were directly involved in the war, and the second generation where the fathers were in the war. And for us, it's the grandfathers, so we have enough distance already, then we can have a bit of a more relaxed look at the whole aspects.
Yeah. So you think that the interest is going to grow over the years, rather?
Well, I think officially now the main research for military history is done by the Bundeswehr, by the ZMS, previously the MGFR. And I think they moved on from the Second World War and go now more into the Cold War and Afghanistan and everything else. So
not so much.
It's not looking very pretty. I mean, Chris and I try to stem the tide a bit, but
so we were talking earlier about the great generals, but the difference between the way in which the generals who functioned in the East were seen as opposed to those who functioned in the West, or those who were in both places. What can you say about that and that dynamism, or the way in which they're interpreted?
I mean, it was generally the viewpoint, at least from some of the Eastern Front, that the Eastern Front, I mean, this was always the main area of the German army. Everything else was a Nebenkriegsschauplatz, a sideshow, basically. So there was Africa, was a sideshow, there was the Western Front, as a sideshow. And there's actually, I found in one document very interesting, there were some volunteers from the Eastern Front that went to Africa. And the people from the Africa complained, like they thought this would be like holiday or something, and actually they having real troubles now, but they stated probably these tries tried to escape from the Eastern Front in a way and thought it would be really nice. And the other major difference is in shortly after the invasion in Normandy, one general was sent over because Rommel and the others were writing reports and they were all very negative, and then the German High Command and others said, you're defeatist, or sorry, I don't know the word exactly, and you're all negative and pessimistic. Let's send somebody from the Eastern Front there. So this general shows up, and the first thing he wants to do is take his biplane, or his Führerschar, it's not a biplane, take his plane to the front line like he does on the Eastern Front. And then people tell him, that's not a good idea. You know, there's air supremacy here in a way. And then he reluctantly agrees, and he takes his car. And I think it takes him a half a day or something, because he constantly gets attacked by fighter bombers, even in his car. And then he really has like the epiphany, okay, this is really very different. And Rommel warned them about this before. But Rommel was also, for instance, if you look at Rommel, he was like about Italy, he was very pessimistic. And then I think Kesselring basically then showed, okay, actually we can hold way longer than we thought. So there's always these different opinions and assessments, and one has to look really close because it's sometimes hard to tell. And I think this is what it comes down to the end. It's complicated, and this is probably why you invited some Germans and Austrians over here.
You talked a bit about Guderian, about Manstein. One of the things that Manstein, of course, self-aggrandizement in his lost victories, was about the Third Battle of Kharkov, where he claims that the Germans were outnumbered 4-1 on the Eastern Front, but he was outnumbered 8-1 on the Eastern Front. What can you say about the sort of manipulation of these sorts of figures and battles, and how these generals, their self-perception, their self-presentation has affected the way in which they're seen now?
So generally there's the problem with these numbers, that how you count. For instance, Wettstein, who is the Swiss expert on urban combat of the Wehrmacht, he looked at the numbers for Stalingrad and the numbers from Glantz, and he noted Glantz puts down the numbers from the German divisions, writes them up basically, because he assumes they're the full strength, which was generally not the case. The other thing is, if you compare them, Soviet divisions generally had a lot of their logistics outside. They were not organic to the divisions. Meanwhile, the German divisions usually had their logistics organically. And then you have the army general troops, I think they're called in English, the Heerestruppen, which is sometimes not counted or differently. So comparing these numbers is pretty hard. From what I know from military intelligence, the Germans had a very good picture on the tactical level, so what divisions they were facing. But once it got like 10 or 20 kilometers behind the front lines, just question marks, because then the military intelligence was really, Fremde Heere Ost, Foreign Armies East, was not very effective in this way. So the numbers could be correct, they could be incorrect. Then there's also the aspect of putting a Schwerpunkt or temporarily, like for instance the Luftwaffe on the Eastern Front, generally mentioned, was able even in 1945 sometimes to achieve temporary air superiority, just for a few hours or something. On the Western Front this was generally not possible at that point or at all. And you could also say, if the spearheads from the Soviets came in at one point, and what part do you look at the front line? Maybe it's true if you look at the front line when the Soviets all lined up, the Red Army, to break through, and the Germans haven't moved the troops into for a counterattack or prepared something. So it could be true. Again, it's complicated, and one had to look at the Soviet documents and the German documents. But one problem is also, if you look at the German losses and their assessment, they know that even their own loss statistics are incorrect to a certain degree, and not intentionally. They are like, we're missing a few people. This is why Overmans did a study on this and tried to find it out with statistical methods. And you have the same also with Soviet sources. For instance, there's also the problem, like, some people say everyone lies in the sources, but I think there was one study on partisan warfare, and they looked at the German claims on sabotage, and the numbers stay the same. But then then for the Soviet side, the higher the level goes, the numbers increase. So the success is the point. Of course, then the author notes they had probably an incentive to give higher numbers, whereas the Germans, to report how much was damaged, they had little incentive to change the numbers because they needed still the material. And at the same time, if they make a larger number, they say you are ineffective in suppressing the partisans. So you could also argue they had no incentive, so and maybe in other cases they had an incentive. The same goes for the tank kills. Fremde Heere Ost, I think in 1943 noted, all the tank kills we get reported from troops, we have to discount by 50%. So some denote some parts is because over-reporting from the kills, which happens by accident or enthusiastic troops. But then I think they made 5 or 6 or 7 points to explain, well, the Soviets will get way better in repairing and maintaining their tanks, so the numbers that can get replaced get put up and everything else. The funny thing is with this document, because I talked with Jens about it, and he says, I know Soviet reports on maintenance and everything, and they are not that good at that point. And so we don't know if Fremde Heere Ost in this document wrote down what they really thought, why the numbers should be discounted by 50%, or if they couldn't say, we don't trust the guys at the front. So we don't know. It could be both, or even a mixture, because it's not valid now that you be honest in the Wehrmacht and other points. Whereas I think it was Williams Murray, and he noted, for instance, for Poland, but that was still a different time, that the German army was very critical about the performance in Poland, and he made, I think, remarks to his service later in the US Army, I think, post-war, and he said, it's common, the higher the report gets, the more flavor or the more nice it gets, whereas he doesn't see this in the German reports. But that was for Poland, and I haven't read the reports myself, so I can only stand by his word by now. And there's also, of course, also a different culture as well. So I think Germans and Austria are generally more direct in a way, and I think this was back then the same, but at one point there was also a change to a certain degree, of course.
So just coming back to these sort of big questions about the generals, like how important are the generals? I mean, no, you don't want to go into the sort of details of one specific general or another, but how important is that figure in battles? And are generals, for example, the Germans, known largely because of the battles that they won or were involved in, rather than that they were competent or other measures of their skill level?
I mean, Herder argues in his book that the German generals had mostly an influence on the tactical level, and even sometimes on the operational level it was limited, because mostly was coming from the German army high command, and also from Hitler in a certain, which was of course there. And that they had very limited chances, and I think he makes also one point that at one point when they had the choice that sometimes it didn't even work out. I think he mentions Fedor von Bock and the offensive against Moscow. And I think it really depends on what you look. If you look at the history of a corps, then of course the corps commander is really important. If you look at the whole level, like with the 6th Army and breaking out of Stalingrad, there you see the inertia of the whole system, as I initially described, and also the breakout at Stalingrad would have been a major problem because the logistical situation was already really bad before they were encircled. So after the encirclement, it's even worse. So from what Hürter wrote, it looked like mostly their influence was very limited and they were basically reduced to technicians. And this was in contrast to how they were before the war or in the other conflicts, because they had more influence. But if you look at the Battle of France, for instance, there it seems that the current research is basically, well, many of the panzer generals basically went rogue and they pulled the whole army with them. Mm-hmm. So this is also, again, it's complicated of what you look.
I've just been given the nod to that we've just got a few minutes, I think, for a couple of questions.
Hi, what do you think the German generals thought they were fighting for in the beginning of the war? When do you think that they realized the strategic inevitability of German defeat? And what were they fighting for after they realized defeat was inevitable?
I mean, in the beginning it was clearly, from what I know, most of them disregarded Poland as a state. So that was basically probably an insult. What later on, and the question about losing the war, I mean, there was some like Beck, who was later involved in the military resistance, and he already, before the war, assumed if a war breaks out, Germany would lose, because he looked at the strategic aspect of resources and everything. Hürter made a very good point that for the generals, it would have been cowardice even if they disagreed with the orders from the high command to leave their post, to be basically put out of command. To a certain degree, they would consider it Fahnenflucht, so basically fleeing from the enemy, to be deserters even, because what he noted is they had a very strong sensibility of Verantwortung, and this was responsibility for their troops, so caring for their troops, and this is also reflected in many of the statements, and also Pflicht, duty. This was very strong in their ethos. So for them, continuing to fight was basically like, the inertia. And we should not forget, these were old people to a certain degree as well. And I see it nowadays with myself. I'm getting old, and sometimes I don't change my ways. And I think there's the psychological aspect. Each of these generals sent hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, 100,000 of soldiers sometimes into death. And after a certain amount, to change your whole view on the subject would require a major shift in the whole psychology. And this is, I think, where the inertia comes in. And so you can see this, I think, very well on social media. I have petty arguments in my YouTube comment section all the time, and nothing. It's about nothing. Nobody died. I killed nobody for these points I'm holding there. And then to think that these people that trained decades and then sent people into their death and killed others or ordered them to kill and everything, that they suddenly change, I think is in many ways a miracle or even impossible for the human mind, how it's structured and it works. Because we are a bit of habit, and also it would need to change that the whole belief system. And if you eradicate one's belief system, I think that's a major problem to, basically survive, especially in a war situation as well.
I've just been told that's it, because the tent apparently has to be cleared out immediately for another speaker. So I'm extremely sorry, but thank you so much, Bernard, for coming to talk to us about this amazing subject.